Hi, I'm Adrian Petterson, a PhD student at the Faculty of Information, University of Toronto. I'll be presenting our paper, Playing with Power Tools, Designing Toolkits and the Framing of Equity, on behalf of my co-authors, Cheng and Priyank Chandra. In recent years, the CHI and larger ACM community have been increasingly concerned with issues of equity in design. In this study, we use toolkits as an artifact signaling how design is currently approaching equity. We define toolkits as having multiple tools or methods to approach a given situation, as well as an explicit suggestion of how to use those tools or methods. As an artifact, toolkits are particularly well suited to show what is considered best practice by its creator. Mattern gives the example of the first aid kit, which contains a collection of tools to provide care if somebody gets a cut, but not a mental health problem. Toolkits show what problems the creator finds relevant and how to solve them from a particular positionality. Since toolkits present a best practice in packaged form, they also serve to simplify approaches to particular problems. Equity as a concept itself is highly complex and has evolved throughout different geographical and temporal contexts. Equity has historically served as a way to think about justice outside of legal institutions to address justice in changing and dependent contexts. As a result, we use Nancy Fraser's 3 dimensions of justice to shape our idea of design equity. The first dimension is recognition, addressing cultural injustices and uplifting difference. The second is redistribution, which addresses socioeconomic and resource injustices. And the third is representation, that requires all interested parties be involved in decision-making and justice-forming processes. In this paper, we look at Fraser's tripartite model of justice. However, while equity has multiple definitions in the context of HCI and design, it is perhaps more vital to understand equity as a process rather than an outcome in itself. Currently, there are 2 main conceptualizations of equity in design scholarship, the first focusing on the so-called digital divide, while some individuals have more access to technology than others. The issue with this concept of equity in design is that it only touches the redistribution dimension of Fraser's justice and encourages a deficit model, where marginalized groups are seen as lacking due to their tech access barriers, and technology is presented as a cure-all solution. In contrast, a world-building approach to design equity advocates for localized design efforts and the expansion of who is considered a designer. Applying all 3 dimensions of justice from Fraser to design, we therefore offer a definition of design equity. Design equity recognizes the oppression that emerges from social systems and designs to address oppression by recognizing marginalized communities, perspectives, and redistributing the power to design via partnerships, resource sharing, and relinquishing privileged power. Armed with this definition of design equity, we sought toolkits by performing searches on the web and in academic journals, word of mouth, and by looking at messages on design-focused Slack and Discord channels. We initially gathered 34 toolkits, but narrowed our collection down to 17 by requiring toolkits explicitly mention design as a focus, addressing a dimension of equity, inclusion, diversity, ethics, or accessibility. We then classified the toolkits based on their source, what sorts of design traditions they pulled on, their cost, what marginalities they addressed, and the format of the toolkit. Next, we performed an artifact analysis using deductive and inductive thematic analysis, using Nancy Fraser's 3 dimensions of justice as a framework. Turning to the results of our thematic analysis, we saw the majority of the toolkits were motivated by the goal of justice. However, few toolkits define what they mean by justice. Using Fraser's definition, we can see where design toolkits have been falling short. I'll touch on 3 that showcase the connection to each of Fraser's justice dimensions. You can find more in our paper. While 10 out of 17 of the toolkits advocated for community members to be involved in the toolkit process, these were mainly as participants rather than authoritative positions. Only 3 toolkits address representation by explicitly involving users and community stakeholders in decision-making. Without a redistribution of power, misrepresentation will remain an issue as there is no active attempt to alleviate the institutionalized barriers that prevent some from participating on par with others, therefore failing Fraser's requirement of representation. Toolkits also addressed designers by using methods that would already be familiar to them. Despite critiques of design thinking, a design approach that has been institutionalized by organizations such as IBM and IDEO, many still use design thinking as a base. We can see here the classic design thinking graphic from the Stanford D School with 5 multicolored hexagons. Then the Liberatory Design Toolkits version with the same 5 hexagons and an additional 2, larger in the background. The Liberatory Design Toolkit underwent a redesign more recently, which resembles design thinking less starkly. However, the steps remain the same. Other toolkits mirror design thinking with the intention of empowering non-designers to speak the same language as designers. The Equity-Centered Community Design Toolkit is one such example. Focusing too heavy on design thinking, however, fails on Fraser's recognition, as it obscures other design approaches that have been sidelined in the prevalence of design thinking. Other design traditions did show up. Participatory design was used in 7 of the toolkits, value-sensitive design was used in 5, and inclusive design was used in 6. These were not mutually exclusive, and many of the toolkits used multiple design approaches in concert. On the dimension of redistribution, toolkits generally fared better, as many approached equity in design through the lens of access rather than world building. Only 6 out of 17 of the toolkits used the business case, claiming that using the toolkits would result in market gain for the toolkit user, which also reinforces resource injustices. Interestingly, these toolkits tended to come from academic sources. However, most toolkits still required some monetary or data value to access the toolkit, failing redistributed justice, except when the toolkit creators were community members or nonprofits, as it would require resources to come from the community to the toolkit creator. This also reinforced the question of who would be accessing and using the toolkits with financial and technological barriers in place. Despite the critiques leveraged in our paper, design equity toolkits do address vital issues in the design industry, and with such complex issues as equitable design, no one solution will ever be perfect. Therefore, I want to end with some suggested supplements to design equity toolkits based on alternative design approaches. The first supplement is real community empowerment. Toolkits must explain the centrality of the strong community relationship, or point to resources that do. Users of the toolkit themselves must ensure that the marginalized voices are being centered in the design process and attending to power structures within the design. Second, toolkit users must embrace the messiness of social justice issues and change. Allowing for heterogeneity in design through working with the community can incorporate recognition justice by legitimating different cultural engagements with design, not just the dominant paradigm. Finally, the framing of design equity toolkits must undergo a shift. At the outset of this study, we asked, how do design equity toolkits signal what approaches to equity the design community is taking? Based on our findings, the design toolkit community is taking an access gap approach mostly to issues of equity, which focuses on spreading technology to communities who do not have it, and overall increasing the number of potential customers. However, the stakes of design equity are much higher than access, and focusing on a deficit model simply exacerbates existing power dynamics. When considering the power of world building with design, the stakes run far beyond individual design interfaces, as it discusses the power to shape our worlds and involves systems of oppression that pervade social and political spaces. Our study has several limitations. We did not address the toolkits in vivo, rather we performed a discursive artifact analysis. With future work, we hope to evaluate the toolkits in action and work with toolkit creators to better understand the systems from which these toolkits emerge. Further, this study focuses on Euro-American design contexts. There are a multitude of other design approaches and framing of equity outside the Euro-American space, which should be analyzed to gain a more fulsome picture of design equity approaches on a global scale. As HCI as a field becomes more concerned with issues of equity, recognizing the social political aspects of technological distribution as well as the larger ontological power of design is vital. No one toolkit or paper can offer a perfect solution, as incorporating diverse standpoints and embracing change cannot be contained within a static artifact. Instead, embracing possibilities and reimagining configurations of power in partnership with the communities can guide design in the mess of equity.